Hi guys, excuse the dressing gown again. I'm going to do this one on YouTube because just a few things I wanted to say without actually, the hand histories are alright, but sometimes it's worth just having a conversation about strategy in general. So this style of play that hopefully you guys have been adopting, being more aggressive, always going to the flop as the pre-flop aggressor, c-betting the right boards with the right sizing. So hopefully, I know Donald's got back to me and Craig's got back to me saying that the style seems to be working well for them and that they're picking the right spots where they're getting folds with their 3-bets, and when their 3-bets are called, that they're getting through the c-bet. So when you start doing this successfully, the good players will start to realise what you're doing. So how do you compensate for that when they're on to you, so to speak? Okay, so the first thing is, so the first thing to do, what will people do when they're on to you? Well, I'll tell you what they'll do. They're going to start calling your raises, they're going to start calling your 3-bets, and they're going to start floating flops to take it on the turn. That's the most effective strategy against what we're trying to do. It's not the way we want to play, but it's the way that our opponents may well play against us. So when this happens, what do? Well, you know that your continuation bet isn't going to get through because you know their whole strategy is to float the flop with a view to taking it away on the turn. So what you start to do is when you miss, you start to check more. Now, when you check, they're going to be, hey, he always c-bets, so he must have something because he's checked. It's reverse psychology almost. So they'll be like, he must have something because he's checked. So they check behind. Because they're calling you, and primarily when they're calling your 3-bets and calling your raises, if they're a good player, they're going to be in position. Because they need to be in position for this to effectively work for them, because they want to float to take is the expression. So they're going to call you a flop bet to take it on the turn. So what you do is that when you've missed, you just check. And they're going to think that you've actually hit and you've been deceptive because they know you always c-bet. So they just check behind, and then you can steal it on a brick turn because they're more worried about you checking the flop than betting the flop. And when you hit, it's great because you c-bet as normal and they're going to call. And you've hit and you're pretty sure you're ahead. And then the best thing to do, and it's wonderful being out of position when you do this, because you know that they probably floated the flop with nothing because their whole strategy is that you're going to sort of stop on the turn and they're going to take it away. But when you hit, you check the turn. Obviously everything in you tells you to bet the turn because that's the normal progression. But when you bet 2 streets, they're going to fold because they've been floating you. So you check the turn, they bet, and then you re-raise and they're like, oh my God, my whole strategy's just gone to pieces because effectively you're now, Graham is now on to me or whatever. That's what they're saying, because I've recognised that they're floating flops and they're taking it away on the turn. So when I've got it, I bet the flop. But I don't continue. I check raise the turn because, then I've got 2 streets of value from them because, they're thinking that I'm waving the white flag when I check the turn. But I'm not. I'm trapping. So that's a very effective thing to do when your 3-bets are getting called in your out position or your raises are getting called in your out position. So if you notice that opponent's doing that to you, don't c-bet when you haven't got it. And then if they check behind, you can c-bet the turn, take it down on the turn. If you do hit, then c-bet as normal and then check raise the turn. It seems completely opposite to what you would do. Normally you've got it, you bet the turn and then bet the flop, and then it's a brick turn, you get some more value. But you know this player, if you bet to him, he's going to think you're putting the white flag up and he's going to raise. So you bet the flop and check raise the turn when you've got it. So that's how you compensate people when they're on to you. As soon as you get on to them being on to you, you're then on to them and you play them accordingly. So the other thing is about continuation betting. So when people call you, your position and their position is very important in regards to their range. Right, now this is, I did a little thing about calling ranges, so I don't think you can see this. Graham's calling ranges based on initial raiser's position and my position. So, and the answer to is never, right? All right, I'm having a little bit of a joke here, but basically what I'm saying is I never want you to be calling pre-flop. But you can go and you can look at all these pre-flop calling ranges charts that say that they're Nash equilibrium calling ranges, which of course is a load of twaddle really. John Nash would probably turn over in his grave. Now you can Nash equilibrium when you've got like heads up, 10 big blind stack, and it's a case of shove or fold. But when you're multi-way and you're talking about calling things, John Nash never did anything game theory that could deal with that. And when people use these terms, Nash equilibrium and that, for some things that can be completely simulated, like a heads up 10 big blind shove or fold scenario, absolutely Nash ranges can be there. You have a game of noughts and crosses, if you play it correctly it's always going to end in a draw, because it's a simple example of Nash equilibrium in game theory. But people will quote Nash calling ranges and stuff like that, and I don't credit it with anything, because my personal Nash calling range is no hands at all. Because I don't want to call other people. They will say. So anyway, take these things with a pinch of salt. That's what I'm saying. So, but the thing is obviously people have their own calling ranges based, and there are charts based on these positions. So if you get called in the big blind and it's an 8 high flop, for example. Now there's a lot of 9-8 suited, 7-8 suited, 8-6 suited, 8-7 off, 9-7 off in the big blind's calling range. So an 8 isn't necessarily a great card to c-bet on if it's an 8 high flop against the big blind that's called. But let's say it was a cut-off that called or something, then he's far more likely to have the king jacks, king queens in his range. And if you hit the 8 high flop, c-bet's probably going to take it down against the cut-off range. Okay, he may be a type player that's got hands like pocket nines, pocket tens in his calling range, but there's a lot more hands. So you're more likely to get a continuation bet through on an 8 high flop against the guy that's called in the cut-off than you are against the guys in the big blind. Now conversely, if it's a king or queen high flop, this guy that's called in the cut-off, your c-bet is not as likely to get through. Obviously, if there's a king and a queen, you don't c-bet unless you've hit. But if there's a king or a queen, I probably would c-bet if I've only got one opponent. But I'd be aware that a guy that's called in the cutoff or the hijack, or even the button, is more likely to hit his range than the guy in the big blind. Of course, the guy in the big blind can still have queen X or king X hands in his ranges, but the guy in the big blind's got a lot of rag aces in his calling ranges. He's got a lot of lower suited connectors in calling ranges, more than like the button, the cut-off and the hijack would have. So when you're doing your continuation bet, think very much about your position, but particularly their position where they called from, because their calling ranges in the small blind, the big blind, the button are, and the hijack and the cut-off are very different, particularly in the blinds. So a low flop might seem like a nice dry flop to c-bet on, but it would probably work better against a caller that was in the hijack than a caller that's in the big blind. If you've got just a king high flop, then that c-bet's probably going to work better against the big blind's range and the small blind's range than the range that is for like the other ranges, the button, the cut off and the hijack. So just bear this in mind when you're making your c-bets. I still think against one opponent you should c-bet most dry boards, but just be aware what their calling range is based on their table position, and that will give you an indication, a better indication as to how likely your c-bet is to get through and whether or not to c-bet that particular board texture against a caller from that table position. Obviously, you add to that the factor of whether they're tight, aggro, or whatever, what their natural ranges are. But just a little bit about positional awareness of your opponents when it comes to c-betting boards. So I hope this is of use, and that's it. Best of luck to you. Cheers.